So just to share with you about Northeast Wilderness Trust, my name is Sophie. I work as the outreach coordinator here at the Wilderness Trust. We are a growing land trust with 9 staff. We're based out of Montpelier, Vermont, but we work across the Northeast from the Adirondacks all the way over to Maine and then down to Connecticut. We work specifically in forever wild conservation. And what that means is that the lands that we protect will never be logged or used for any kind of extractive economic purpose. They are protected first and foremost for wild nature, for the beings who call that land home. And so they're governed by natural processes rather than by human management. To date, we've protected 41,000 acres as such, and currently we have about 20,000 more acres in the project pipeline that we're working to preserve as forever wild. One example of that is the beautiful Grafton Forest Wilderness Preserve, which we are working to protect. We need to raise $1 million by the end of the year to make this place forever wild. This photograph was taken by Jerry Monkman, who I think is in the audience tonight. Thanks, Jerry, for sharing this gorgeous landscape with us. This place is 1,300 acres of gorgeous high elevation forest just next to the Appalachian Trail in Maine. So that's just a taste of the kind of work that we do. We're also a member of the Global Rewilding Alliance, which just launched this year, and to celebrate that, we are raffling off a beautiful hornbeck canoe. We'll be drawing the winner for that on National Canoe Day in June, so I'll post a link to that as well. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Bill McKibben, whose reputation precedes him. I'm sure all of you know Bill as one of the foremost advocates of our time in the fight against climate change. I first heard of you, Bill, when I was involved in the fossil-free movement in college, and that's been a major part of my life ever since. It's less known, and I didn't know this at first, that Bill, perhaps unsurprisingly, has his roots in wilderness conservation and a deep love of wild places. So he's here tonight to share with us about the nexus of those two passions. I also want to take this moment just to thank you, Bill, for being an advisor to Northeast Wilderness Trust. We truly appreciate you serving in this capacity for us. So thank you, Bill.
Well, Sophie, thank you so much. And what a pleasure it is to get to join everybody. You know, I've gotten to be a part of Northeast Wilderness Trust almost, I think, from its inception, or maybe even a little bit before, many, many, many years ago, and many, many friends who've done this hard work for a long time. And I'm eternally grateful to them, most of all when I get to go wander on the land that they've saved, but at all times, because of course, in some ways, the highest value of wilderness is just knowing that it's there, even when you're not out wandering on it. And it's a great pleasure to get to join this crew today. I'm riffled through the list of attendees, and so many old friends and neighbors and people who have done astonishing work. And of course, I'm well aware that I'm bringing coals to Newcastle, seems the wrong image, solar to the Mojave, in talking about all these questions with y'all, because you already know about them. But what the hell, we're all here, and so I will talk for a few minutes. My plan is to talk to about the bottom of the hour, and then if people have questions, I'll do my best to answer them. And if not, everybody can just go eat dinner too, which would be fine. I will say, for those of you who are distant today, that it's a beautiful wet day in the northern mountains, and it's been blessedly a wet week or two, at least here in the Greens, which was really something because the forest was darn dry not long ago, and now it's very, very good to see that it has soaked up all that water for the last few days. There were a lot of newts and salamanders out wandering around in the woods today, and very, very good to see. I'm going to talk for a minute just about the science and where we are right now on climate change, because I think it sort of informs the way that we need to think about kind of all the questions that surround wilderness and wild places. Some of you know, I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect, back in 1989 when I was a young man. And though we knew at the time all that really we needed to know, you know, burn coal, gas, oil, put carbon in the atmosphere, the planet heats up. We didn't know quite how fast it was going to happen or how hard it was going to pinch. And of course, the story of the last 30 years is it pinched really hard and really fast. And so now we're in, well, we're in a kind of literal hot water all over the place. And I'm not going to spend an immense amount of time just going through all of the bad things that are going on, because you know about a lot of them, but I want to just talk about them, give you for a few minutes a sense of scale, just so one's reminded about the scale on which we need to be working in response. You know, the extra heat that we trap in the Earth's atmosphere each day because of the carbon we've produced from the oil and coal and gas that we've burned, it's the heat equivalent each day of about 500,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And when you think about it in those units, it becomes easier to picture in your mind the scale of the damage we've been doing. It becomes easier to understand how it is, for instance, that we've melted more than half of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. And I use that as an example because it's both profound in its implications and effects, and because it itself illustrates the kind of nasty feedback loop we're in. When we took all that nice white ice away and replaced it with blue water, we went from reflecting 80% of the incoming solar radiation back out to space. We basically had a nice mirror at the top of the planet, to absorbing a huge amount of that in the blue seawater that replaced it. I mean, just to give you again, to sort of drive home the scale, if you go back and look at the pictures of the Earth that came back from outer space in 1968, our first kind of view of the world, and there's people, I'm sure there's one or two other people on this call like me who are old enough to remember those. The world doesn't look like that anymore. Come to think of it, it's sort of the reverse of what happened to me. There's a lot less white up top there than there was 40 or 50 years ago. One of the biggest physical features on the planet is now deeply changed. And of course, when you change things on that scale, everything else begins to change. One of the things we think is a result of the rapidly melting Arctic and the opening up of the Arctic Ocean is that the jet stream has begun to behave in unusual fashion. It's both deeper in its curves, it goes further north and south and in its amplitude, and it gets stuck for longer periods of time, which emerging body of science indicates is the reason that we get stuck in these periods of drought or of rainfall and flood. And these are getting, I mean, as you know, remarkably, remarkably severe. I was just talking 20 minutes ago with friends and colleagues in the Bay Area where they're on a forest fire watch. I think it's the earliest red flag warnings they've ever had out in, but fire season now can last all year because it gets so dry. And you also allow for the incursion of enormous amounts of what should be polar air further south when you get these vortex events like the one that hit Texas earlier this year with such extreme result. So the jet stream is behaving in screwy fashion, but at the same time, all that ice, as it melts, is producing, there's a lot of fresh water flowing into this system. That's because when that ice froze originally, the salt precipitated out. So ice is essentially freshwater. And when you get that pulse of big freshwater there and off the ice sheet in Greenland, you begin to monkey with the differences in salinity and hence density that drive the great ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream. There's already pretty strong evidence that we've seen something like a 15% reduction in the flow of those great Atlantic currents. The main current there, the Atlantic meridional overturning current, has a volume about 100 times the size of the Amazon River. So we're talking about a very, very big effect, and reducing it even by 15% is obviously enormous. I don't say all this because I want to talk about oceanography or atmospheric meteorology or anything. I'm saying it just to give you a sense of scale, just so you understand the size of the forces that we're playing with now. And I want you to understand just also the size of the human forces that unleashes. Last autumn was the worst hurricane tropical storm season we've ever measured, at least by number of storms in the Atlantic. And the last two storms of the year, we'd run out of, you'll remember, of the conventional alphabet and had to delve into the Greek alphabet. The last two storms of the year, big November storms, much bigger than you should get in November. Cat 4, Cat 5 storms, Eta and Iota, didn't hit the US, they hit Central America. They hit 10 days apart, about 10 miles apart, and they did extraordinary damage. We think that the damage to Honduras was the rough equivalent of 40% of the country's GDP. So by contrast, the worst storm in American history, Katrina, did damage roughly equivalent to 1% of our GDP. And so that means, obviously, that there are a lot of people who can no longer earn their living in Honduras. Their farm fields are covered with sand, or the roads and bridges on which they depended to take produce to market are gone and will be out for years. And so many have begun the trek to the southern border. And when they get there, I don't know quite what their legal claim will be, but their moral claim is obvious. Nobody in Honduras did a thing to cause global warming. If you look at their carbon emissions as individuals and as nations, they're rounding errors in the calculations. The 4% of us who live in this country produced way more CO2 than any country on Earth over the last 100 years. And 100 years is about how long a CO2 molecule lingers in the atmosphere. So they have a strong claim, is what I'm saying. And they're the vanguard of what the UN estimates, if we don't get climate change quickly under control, will be about 1 billion climate refugees, high estimate, by the end of the century. So try to imagine a world in which there's, 1 person in 7 dislocated and on the move, and try to imagine what, anything about that world, war and peace, the rights of women, the ability to do healthcare and development, national security, on and on and on. Again, all I'm trying to do is give you a sense of scale at which to then consider the actions that we need to take. And so I guess a way of saying it is it's very big, so we better act in very big ways too. And they better be very smart ways. The first thing we've got to do, and this is the basic bottom line, we have to stop burning stuff. We have to stop burning coal and gas and oil, and we have to stop burning biomass, wood, which has become a real contentious issue in eastern forests, because people have begun putting up facilities to take trees and convert them into electricity on the grounds that this is somehow carbon neutral. So far, the damage to the northern forest has been less than to the forests of the southeast, which are being cut wholesale, pelletized, put on ships and sent to Britain, where they're a huge source, or burned in huge quantities in former coal-fired power stations. And the theory for a while was, well, eventually a tree will grow in its place and suck up the carbon. So, it's net carbon neutral. But that makes no sense anymore. The science, and here one really wants to credit Bill Numa at Tufts as doing some of the really important work. The science has made it clear over the last few years that 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 because burning biomass releases this huge pulse of carbon right now, it doesn't really matter what happens 50, 60, 70 years down the road in terms of soaking it up. The damage in terms of breaking the back of the climate system is being done right now, right around us. I say that today only because I know that there's a lot of people on here who care about forests and think about them. And it's really important to understand, I think, that this is a dead end in a big way. At any rate, the good news, if you want a little good news, is we understand what to do instead of coal and gas and oil. It's mostly rely on the fact that 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 the sun is burning 93 million miles away, and we know how to harness its power now. We know how to take solar panels and use them to catch the sun's energy. We know how to take wind turbines and capture the differential between the differential heating of the planet that results in wind. And that's really, really important. Um, um, the most useful thing that happened over the last decade was that engineers drove the price of sun and wind power down by an order of magnitude to the point where it's now the cheapest way to generate power on the planet, which is very good news because it turns out we can do the things that we need or want to do, move ourselves and our possessions around in vehicles, buses, and trains, heat our homes, cook our food with the electricity that that produces. And if we do it wisely, and if we think about efficiency and conservation, well, we have at least some hope of taking on the extraordinary task that science has set us, which is to deal with that climate problem in very, very short order. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the kind of governing scientific authority here, produced their most recent report in October of 2018. And what they said was that we had until 2030 to, as they put it, fundamentally transform the Earth's energy system, which they helpfully defined as cutting emissions in half, if we wanted to have any chance of meeting the targets that we set in Paris just, 6 years ago now. So that's a very, very, very tall task. It's at the bleeding edge of the technically possible and of the politically possible. We're beginning to see with President Biden's infrastructure bill, the first step, first tentative steps that America is taking in that direction. There's some of that going on in other countries, but not enough. And of course, at all times, it fights hard against the vested interest and political power of the fossil fuel industry, which for decades, maybe a century, was the richest industry on the planet and retains enormous outsized influence. That's why many of us devote much of our lives to trying to stop the expansion of their projects, things like the Keystone or Line 3 or Dakota Access pipelines, or trying to undermine their financial power. That's why we've carried out this huge divestment campaign around the planet that now is at about $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have joined in. So that's the big, broad, global canvas on which this story is playing out. So now let's talk a little bit about the places where we live, about wild places, about the forests of the Northeast. First thing to be said, obviously, is that they're by no means immune to any of this. In fact, it's going to be the largest factor by far affecting their future over the decades to come. That's, not the only thing, obviously. You can go down a long list from the emerald ash borer to the spread of development to, on and on and on. But viewed in the largest terms, climate change will, change in every way the world as we know it. I've written a lot about Vermont and the Adirondacks, the two places that are closest to my heart, um, in terms of the impact of climate change that one can expect in the years ahead. But you already know most of what it's about. Under any kind of business as usual scenario where we don't get dramatic change very fast, winter continues its decline into essentially one long mud season. Um, you know, skiing is perhaps retained on alpine slopes that face north for a few months or a few weeks or something on man-made snow, but things like cross-country skiing and snowmobiling sort of slowly, or maybe not so slowly, disappear. Um, the the forest that we're accustomed to, in many places, birch, beech, maple, that provide our autumn colors, is increasingly displaced to the north, replaced by maybe, if we're lucky, some oak and hickory, which turn a nice drab brown come fall. Um, um, even the kind of all the other Currier and Ives scenes that we're kind of used to, like spring sugar season and things, are called dramatically into question because they're all exquisitely dependent on the particular climatic regime that grew up here. Um, and of course, all the flora and fauna that inhabit this place are similarly stressed. So that's one reason why, given the bigness of the challenge that we face, the conservation answer in part has to involve bigness on its own, about thinking about how we build big natural reserves and capacious connections between them to allow the flow of life to the north as this process continues. And it's why what Northeast Wilderness Trust is doing is so important, and it's why the work that so many others are doing is so important. I think of the years I spent on the board at the Conservancy in the Adirondacks, when great conservationists like Mike Carr were able to secure hundreds of thousands of acres of land in the Adirondacks, under the argument that we needed that kind of space, that we had to add to the size of the forest preserve, largely in order to allow the maintenance and travel of lots of species, as the climate shifted and changed. And I think that will continue, and that argument becomes ever stronger all the time. I think we also need to think about the ways in which these lands and other lands might serve as part of the answer to the problem that we face. Not all of it. I mean, job one is always going to be to stop burning coal and gas and oil and wood and replace it with sun and wind and other renewable energies. But forests also play, obviously, an important role, or could, in sequestering carbon. At the moment, a fair amount of the carbon that humans produce is absorbed, sequestered by the forest and by the oceans. But these mechanisms are beginning to break down as the planet warms. There was a very revealing and scary, frankly, set of studies released 3 or 4 days ago from the Amazon about tropical forests. And what they said was, over huge data sets over the last decade, it appears that the Amazon has now flipped from a carbon sink to a carbon source, i.e., under the stress of logging and expansion, and as the climate warms and things begin to dry out, the trees and soils of the Amazon are now releasing more carbon to the atmosphere than they store, which is very daunting math. And the more places where that happens, the more daunting the math becomes. And unfortunately, we have reason to think that a lot of that may be underway and growing. Think about the boreal forest, which exists at the northern edges of the area where Northeast Wilderness Trust works, but which dominates much of Canada and especially Siberia. We've seen vast, vast forest fires there the last few years. 2020 saw the biggest Siberian fires by far, and some of them, sadly, got into the peat soils that underlay much of that boreal forest and burned all winter long. There were spooky pictures that scientist friends of mine were sending me from Siberia of smoke coming up from under, 3 and 4 feet of snow on days when the temperature was, 40 below zero, but the fires lingered. And of course, that produces this enormous carbon feedback. The work that's been done in the last few years, and again, much of it by Bill Muma, or some of it, indicates that forests are sequester the most carbon. That big old forests and big old trees within those forests are crucial for sequestering carbon, that they sequester the most carbon. And indeed, this work's really interesting because we used to think, that young trees grew vigorously and so they must accumulate the most carbon. But it turns out that trees accumulate, at least in the species and stands and things that people have studied so far, accumulate more carbon in their second quarter century than their first, and more in their third than in their second. And it seems to continue. And that is very, very interesting news and should change our sense or dramatically affect our sense of what it is that we're trying to preserve and why we're trying to preserve it. The bottom line goal, and I know I'm dragging on here, and I promised you that I'd stop after a half an hour, which I'm coming up on, so I will stop in a second. But the bottom line is that we need to figure out, and sooner rather than later, how to make very large scale change very fast. Now, some of that is about individual lifestyles and the things that we do. So, I'm happy that I know how to eat locally, and I'm very glad that I have solar panels all over my roof and that they connect to an electric car and blah, blah, blah. But truthfully, I'm cognizant that that's not how we're going to solve this problem at this point. We've waited 30 years to get started here. Mostly we waited that 30 years, and we can talk about this because of the immoral and frankly disgusting effort of the fossil fuel industry to lie about what they knew very good and well was a horrible problem. But let's leave that for the moment. Having wasted those 30 years, we now have to squeeze the work of 4 decades into 1 decade. We have to move with great speed, which means that we're not going to do it one Tesla at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. The most important thing that individuals can do in this scenario is to probably be less individual, to join together with other people in movements large enough to make real change. So along with the important work that you're doing at places like the Wilderness Trust, you also need to be joining together with people at 350.org or Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for the Future and Sunrise Movement and all the other great organizations that have arisen over the course of the last decade. Even as the engineers have been doing their work with panache and success, so have movement builders. And they've emerged with what is maybe the largest movement the world's ever seen, which would be good because it's the biggest problem the world has ever seen. And together they may have, we increasingly have the power to at least counterbalance the influence of the fossil fuel industry and allow reason some chance to prevail. And so I will just sort of end with a pitch to please keep doing that kind of work too. I guess a way to say it is that the burden of what I've been telling you is the planet is way outside its comfort zone. So we need to be outside our comfort zones too, whatever that means. For me, over the last decade, it's meant going to jail a surprising number of times for someone who's quite, quite law-abiding for the most part. um, um, uh, but has come to understand that sometimes civil disobedience is a way in which we call attention to things that need attention to them. And I will say, particularly in case there are any other people of my vintage listening, that I think it's particularly important for older people to be thinking about these things. Increasingly, that's the organizing work that I'm interested in. And I remember the beginning of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline. Now, a decade ago, a battle we finally have permanently won. Um, um, we didn't think we could win. No one had ever beaten the oil industry, but we knew we had to try. And so I wrote the letter that asked people to come to Washington to get arrested. And I see a few people on this list who answered that letter, and many thanks to you. And one of the things I said at the time was I didn't think that young people should have to be the cannon fodder here. Because if you're 19, even though you're doing most of the leading in the climate fight, it's possible that an arrest record is not the thing you most need, um, uh, on your resume. Whereas, you know, past a certain point, one of the unmixed blessings of growing older is what the hell are they going to do to you? And so it was good to see people arriving who with hairlines like mine. In fact, you might think of them as the kind of equivalent of those sort of older, bigger trees in the forest that have some work yet to do. Uh, in fact, a lot of work yet to do. Um, we didn't ask people how old they were when they were getting arrested, because that would seem rude. But we did say, cleverly, I think, who was president when you were born. And the two biggest cohorts came from the FDR and the Truman administrations, which was really good. Young people got to see their elders acting the way that we need um, elders to act in a working society. So there's good forest biologists here, and I'm not going to go over an elaborate metaphor about forest succession and so on and so forth. Suffice it to say that the metaphor should be somewhat clear. Um, we all have some work to do still ahead of us. I'm not going to promise you that even if we do everything right, we're going to win. We don't know that. This is a time-limited test. We're behind. The physical momentum of these systems is large. We're obviously not going to win entirely. There's going to be big damage. There already is. And we have to accept that and figure out how to ameliorate it as best we can. And our job is mostly to keep it from getting any worse than it has to get. I can't guarantee you we're going to win, but I can guarantee you that we're going to fight. And I guess I'll really will finish just by saying that because I've gotten to spend so much time over the last few years, last decade, all over the planet. 350.org works in every country except North Korea. I can tell you that you have brothers and sisters across the planet who care about these same things and are working hard on them, many of them in places that did nothing to cause the problem that we now face. And so that's a good thing to know. There's some solace in that solidarity, and I hope that you can feel it. I know that they're paying careful attention and are thankful for the work that y'all are up to. And so there I will stop and Sophie attempt to deal with questions if there are some. But thank you so much for listening, and I wouldn't blame a soul if they wanted to go off and now acquire some dinner instead.
Well, I think you've got a captive audience because we've got, I think, more questions than we'll have time for, and we'll wrap up at 6:30, and we'll get to as many of these as we can by that time. So to start off, we've got a question about the controversy of solar developments causing deforestation. What are your thoughts on how to resolve that issue?
Right. Well, I mean, we in fact think that solar, I mean, the good news is that we think that solar and wind are going to take less land than people sometimes think, partly because they're becoming steadily more efficient. There's a big news study. I write a free climate newsletter that you can read for free at the New Yorker, even if you're not a subscriber, called The Climate Crisis. And last week's issue was devoted to this big news study all over the world about the fact that renewable energy is becoming very, very cheap, and the fact that it takes up less space than people sometimes imagine. In fact, the estimate was that we could produce the renewable energy that we needed in this country on less land than we're currently using to produce fossil fuel, which is good news. But it takes some, there's no question, because, whereas fossil fuel is incredibly concentrated in its effects, sun and wind power aren't. They're diffuse. And so you have to take some acreage to collect them. So I think that the first thing to do is not to be cutting down wilderness in order to make that happen, because there's other land. Some of it's on top of roofs, but there's not enough of that to make this happen, um, um, by itself. So some of it's on all kinds of other land. Here in the Champlain Valley, where I am, there's a lot of abandoned agricultural land that people are using for this purpose. And there's a lot of land or some land that's being taken out of agricultural production and used for solar power. And I think a way to think about it is, um, um, you know, electrons are a crop, one that we use and need. So in the Champlain Valley, for instance, what we mostly grow on agricultural soils is corn. Uh, uh, and if you think about it, corn is just a different form of solar collector, and it has to be, unfortunately, fertilized every year. And the fertilizer washes into Lake Champlain and causes the pollution, the algal blooms and things that we see there. Um, if you can replace some of that, and the corn is then used to produce milk, subsidized milk, which is a crop we actually don't need more of. We do need more clean electrons. And so if you take land and use it to grow that crop instead, well, yes, you've covered it with a solar panel, at least some of it, although increasingly people are figuring out cleverly how to farm, how to, in between the rows, how to put crops like the shade that it produces, how to graze animals around solar panels, who often also provide the benefit of making sure that weeds don't grow up to choke them and things. So I guess I'm saying our aesthetic, if that's the thing that's holding people back, needs to shift some here. And I think the same with wind turbines. I don't think we need them everywhere, and I hope we can figure out how not to take down too much wilderness. But the wind is at the top of ridges. Um, I live underneath Middlebury Gap here in central Vermont. Middlebury Gap has a ski area at the top of it, the Snow Bowl for Middlebury. It also has, we think, a good wind resource. The Middlebury College put up a test turbine a few years ago, and within 6 weeks it had blown over, which struck me as a good sign. Um, um, and so I hope that the day will come in not too long when there'll be a big wind turbine at the top of my valley. Not because I, all things being equal, would love it, but because all things aren't equal. And because the biggest threat by far to the regions that we love is not the incursion of wind turbines or solar panels, it's the rise in temperature. And if we don't get that under control, well, we're not going to have anything that is, that mean conservation will be a moot point because there won't be much to conserve.
Thank you. Here's a question from Isaac. Do you have any concerns about voluntary forest credits on managed timberlands and the net zero by 2050 emission targets that are being made by Vermont Gas Systems and other large corporations, if meeting these targets relies specifically on those types of carbon credits?
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna, carbon credits and carbon offsets and all of this are need to, if you're going to use them at all, they need to be managed with an eagle eye, because they're often a recipe for, well, for just continuing business as usual and doing, the sort of equivalent of um, what in the Middle Ages was like buying indulgences from the church, uh,
Mm.
so you could keep sinning. Um, the credits are often for things that would be happening anyway. The point is that, if you're like Vermont Gas Systems, what we need you to do is stop moving gas and go into the business, which in the case of, say, Vermont Gas would be easy to go into the business with your sister company, Green Mountain Power, of transforming every house in Vermont so that it uses an air source heat pump and an induction cooktop, and doesn't need gas anymore, can run on electricity.
Thank you. Um, another Vermont question that I'm sure a lot of people across northern New England can relate to. A lot of folks heat primarily with wood that is harvested locally. Is that a bad idea?
Yeah, I would not. I mean, I would not obsess about your wood stove. It's not going to make or break the thing here. And I've spent a good deal of my life getting up at 3 in the morning to stoke the wood stove and so on. But I will say that the alternatives are increasingly attractive. These air source heat pumps are for real. They're terrifically good technology, and they work well now in cold climates. So, I think if you can, that's where to look. And then, if there's a few really cold days a year when you need to supplement it with your wood, with your Vermont Castings Resolute, then don't worry about it.
All right, so nobody needs to throw their wood stove out the window just yet. Question from Renee. When it comes for, and I think about this a lot as well, Renee. Why is it when it comes to our quest for energy independence from fossil fuels and reduction in oil and gas, that so much more the focus is on climate change and its impact to people than biodiversity, which is related to climate change, but also has its own reasons for this precipitous loss of species diversity, the sixth mass extinction, as it's now known, caused by people. So what do you think about that not getting the attention it deserves, and how we can change that?
About what not getting the attention it deserves?
The biodiversity crisis of the sixth mass extinction
Yeah.
happening right
Well,
now.
I mean, so there's an ongoing biodiversity crisis and ongoing extinction. But the thing that in the next 50 years, the science is pretty clear that the thing that's going to turbocharge it and turn it into one of the great extinction events in the planet's history is the very rapid increase in the planet's temperature. Look, we're doing all sorts of things that are dumb and that we can learn to do better. And some of them we are. Human beings have managed to drop their fertility rates, for instance, enormously. We've gone from a world where the average woman had 6 kids to where it's 2.3. And we've done it in the course of 40 years, which is an almost unbelievable change in a basic bottom line human reality. So good on us for that. Um, and the population is going to continue to go up for a little while, just because of demographic momentum, and we should continue doing the thing that produced that great decline in population, which basically was educating and empowering women around the world. But that's not what's going to drive climate change at this point. In any event, because the countries where population is still increasing use so little energy that they're not important factors. But we should be working on all the other things too that are crucial. And when it comes to biodiversity, we know a lot about where hotspots are that we have to protect. We need to be working, as I said before, on corridors and connections, all these kind of things. But none of it's going to make a hoot of difference if the temperature of the planet goes up 2 or 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, which is what we're on track for now. And if that happens, then everything's just, the wipeout's going to be, almost total. There are already ecosystems that the rising heat is essentially totally wiping out. The coral reef biologists say that if we hold temperature increase to 1.5%, 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would be a real stretch, we'd only lose 95% of the world's coral reefs. If it goes to 2 degrees, it'll be more like 99%. I mean, that's this kind of level of grimness that we're already at. So we, you know, that remains job one, I think.
Thank you. So question from William. How can the, sort of like more technicalities, how can the majority of power delivered by the grid be switched to wind and solar when those forces are intermittent compared to gas and coal?
Super good question. Super good question. And the nice answer is that batteries are now on the same plummeting price curve that we saw with sun and wind over the last decade. And so now we're already at the point where in most of the world, a big solar field with a big battery sitting next to it is cheaper than building the gas peaker plants and gas backup and stuff for renewables. And that'll just get easier as time goes on. And if you want to see some examples of these kind of big batteries, you don't have to go. I mean, there's, you know, those, if you live near Rutland, the old dump behind the high school has a couple of, you know, big tractor trailer sized batteries, and they're quite amazing. I mean, they work within milliseconds. If the sun goes behind a cloud, it compensates instantly for the keep, you know, voltage up across the grid. And this stuff just gets better all the time. So we owe a great debt to engineers for doing good work on this kind of stuff.
Great, that's great to hear. Just wanted to draw folks' attention. Dan Helmer has shared in the chat about an action against a pipeline, and it sounds like somebody else had is pointing folks towards some further actions in June around that pipeline. So definitely check that out with regards to the cross-pollination of our movements.
Right, and do very much think of the, you know, especially for those of us who care about northern climes, our brothers and sisters in Minnesota right now, especially indigenous communities, are fighting super hard against this Line 3 tar sands pipeline. That's just the kind of equivalent of the Keystone. And they're doing tremendous work against tremendous odds. It would be awfully nice if the Biden administration figured out a way to pull the plug on this one too.
Great. Let's all put in some time, a little bit of time towards that. Maybe we can fit in one, maybe two more questions in the next 10 minutes. So I've got one from Jonathan here. Jonathan's always interested in the process of changing the hearts and minds of people through storytelling that breaks through the veneer of everyday life that we're stuck in. How do you think that we get through to the hearts of people and inspire collective action?
So I think that Jonathan's absolutely right, that storytelling is a big part of what we do, and it's why I write books and try to tell stories when I talk about the things around me. I think that the ironically, one of the things that we have going for us is that one of the best tellers of stories around us is Mother Nature. And at the moment, she's telling a collection of horror stories that are beginning to sink into people. And that's one of the reasons that the survey data shows that people's minds have been substantially changed around climate change. You know, at a certain point, enough forest fires, enough floods, who are you going to believe? Fox News or your own lying eyes, you know? The next part of this is, and that process has proceeded. We're now at the point where 70% of Americans understand that we face some kind of real crisis with climate change. They may not quite understand the temporal urgency, but they get that we're in a fix. The next part of that is convincing people that they have some agency to do something about it. And that's why it's so important that we keep building and supporting the movements that have sprung up, because that's the way that people acquire agency. As I said before, your intuition that as an individual you can do very little about this is in fact correct. By yourself, you know, you can make yourself feel guilty or crazy or virtuous or whatever else, but you cannot affect the outcome, but you can in connection with other people.
I've done all those things, made myself feel all those. So
Yes.
sure, there are folks out there who can relate. All right. And so coming back to this transition to renewable energy, I also grapple with this question about mining of all the
Mm,
resources, transportation, um, you know, all the extractive
yep.
things
And
that need to happen to create that.
it's very tough. Um, um, and there's no, I mean, there is no free lunch. We're in the position of a, you know, an emergency room doctor who has to triage a stream of trauma patients, and you have to figure out which trauma is the worst that you have to get to right away. Now, we can and should work really hard to make sure that things like mining lithium for batteries are done cleanly as possible. And as important as cleanliness, with as little human rights violations as possible. I think we're going to start figuring out, for instance, the Chinese may be using forced labor to mine lithium, um, and that's not good. Um, um, but having said that, as we do everything we can along this way, it does not detract from the fact that we have to deploy at speed and at scale renewable energy, because uh, you know, I've spent much of my life working not only on that question, but also on the question of trying to get people to change the ways in which they live and to live more simply and to build economies that are simpler. And I think those things are very important. But I've also concluded that it's not going to happen at the scale we need and the time that we have. So that's being as realistic and blunt as I can. If you'd rather me not, you know, I'm happy to try and paint a nicer picture, but I don't, it's, you know, part of what writers and journalists, which I am at root, are, is a kind of certain honesty about things.
Yeah, and that's why you're here. Thank you. Um, somebody mentioned Bitcoin mining. I don't even know how a
Oh, I
Bitcoin.
can tell you just how that connects. I wrote about it last
Oh,
week or the
really?
week before. Um, Bitcoin mining is emerging as a real problem, including in the Northeast. There are power plants, one in the Finger Lakes, that were gas-fired or coal-fired power plants that were on the that were had been shut down, and they've now been bought and put back into service, burning fossil fuels simply in order to support the huge banks of computers so people can mine bitcoins. Um, Already, we think that the total energy use is larger than some, say, Scandinavian countries. And it's absurd. I mean, Bitcoin is absurd to begin with. It's just some libertarian, you know, fantasy about not wanting to trust the government with anything, and so we have to do everything privately and blah blah blah. And the way of, you know, which is a huge problem in and of itself. We need the solidarity between people that government is, you know, and it's dumb to try and undermine it, but it's particularly dumb to try and undermine it by burning huge amounts of coal producing imaginary coins. When historians look back at our period of time and wonder what went wrong, that strikes me as one thing they might seize on.
Yeah, I picture like an extraterrestrial showing up and seeing this sort of thing happening, and just how insane it would seem. Um, well, thank you so much for your time, Bill. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you tonight. I always appreciate your honesty and the call to action. And
Well, and it's a pleasure for me. And none of these questions are easy. I mean, I see people in the chat saying, "Oh, it's just hand waving to say we need to do something cleanly or whatever." People should go to work on this. and don't look to me or I mean, look, the people who are working, volunteering like me full time to try and do these things have a lot of work to do and are working super hard. And so we need some of the rest of you working on things like trying to figure out how to make lithium mining as clean as possible and whatever else. It takes work and a lot of it. So do it. Don't complain about it. But I am extraordinarily grateful to the people who have made Northeast Wilderness Trust work. Having an intact forest is one of the things that helps deal with the crisis that we're in and will in the future. And B is one of the things that is the reward for, the work that we do, is that we still have the world around us. And I will just finish by saying that human beings are the animal that notices, that is fully, that can take in and understand in all its glory the world that is around us. And that's a world that's not going to get, it's not going to be any more intact than it is right now. So one of our jobs is simply to get out and pay attention to it and love it, you know. Um, and it's certainly what keeps me going. And so I am, living as I do on the edge of the land that people have preserved in national forests and in the Adirondack Forest Preserve. I'm extraordinarily grateful to the people who came before us and did this work. And now it's up to us to keep doing it.
Indeed. And just in response to the world ever being more intact than it is, I think we will see a decrease in some places, but my hope with Northeast Wilderness Trust's work and the work of our partner organizations that I know are working day in and day out to create new wildlife corridors and reconnect and even restore lands that had seen so much degradation. I know you've spoken, Bill, before often about like the rewilding success story of the Adirondacks and how this entire region had once been denuded of almost completely of forest land, and we've seen it come back. My hope, and I hang on to this strongly, is that we will see a more intact world, and that maybe in some places we will see it reduce. And I hope in the long run, I hope before my life is out, that at least in some places we see it become more intact.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sophie. You give us all hope.
Likewise. Thank you, Bill. Take care and keep on fighting the good fight, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Good night.